So, end times speculation is not anything new. But let me suggest that maybe the politicians shouldn't dabble in it because they're not good at it. This is a recent example. This is from March 29th of this year. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene decided that she knows what the mark of the beast is. Good to know that a politician has plumbed the depths of the theological question and come up with the answer. They might as well call it Biden's mark of the beast. The theology of that is so shallow and so poor and so historically inaccurate that it hardly bears refuting. But I could do it in just a few seconds. The mark of the beast, as John wrote it, and the church has always understood it for well nigh 2,000 years, is worship of something that is not God. Worship. It's based on worshiping something that is not God. It's not about public health, it's not about commerce, it's not it's not social security numbers, it's not all of that nonsense that has been said over the last 100 years, basically, where people have decided that this technological thing or that technological thing is the mark of the beast. All of which is nonsense and pathetic to try to do that. I find it extremely disturbing that a sitting member of Congress would declare that a fellow American is behind the mark of the beast for political gain. That's sad. Because Christians will believe that. Some Christians will believe this. This idea that COVID-19 is a sign of the end times and that therefore the vaccine is going to be the mark of the beast, it's not new. She didn't make that up. It's been going around the internet for a long time. I actually posted something showing how that was ludicrous and how the Apostle Paul would have looked at that and said, I have no idea what you're talking about. How could medical care be the mark of the beast? It doesn't make any sense. Because you know what the mark of the beast was to the early church? There were two ideas. The early church associated the mark of the beast with being required by the Roman Empire to worship a statue, an idol of the emperor, on pain of death. They thought the Antichrist was Nero because of some stuff that John put in there that actually probably has a first fulfillment and a second fulfillment. They looked at actually being told to worship a false god. And so the church has always looked at the mark of the beast like that. And yet, here we have, in the midst of our pandemic and our public health crisis, amateur theology. But it's not new. People always feel the need, and have for many years, to decide to tell you what they have discovered about the end times. The wisdom that they have found and how they are sure that such and such is going to happen. One of the main reasons we have the Jehovah's Witnesses this day is because a Baptist minister by the name of Miller predicted that in the 19th century Jesus was coming back. He'd done the math, and he knew that Jesus was coming back. They were called the Millerites, people that sold their houses and quit their jobs because it was going to happen. And then it didn't happen. And because of that disappointment, grew the movement that led to not only the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. 3 different groups built off of the disappointment that Jesus didn't come back when everybody thought he was going to. Let's look at what Jesus actually has to say about this topic. Maybe we should listen to him, and that's what we're going to do. Chapter 13, verse 1. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." So Jesus has spent this day teaching in the temple courts, and now he and his disciples are leaving Jerusalem once again to go out to Bethany for the evening, and they're leaving the temple courts. We don't know why one of the disciples decided that he would point out the temple. Jesus has been in this temple many times, right? He's been coming here on a regular basis since he was a teenager. And yet, he points out, now, again, this is a large and impressive building. It is a beautiful architectural and artistic wonder. A total remodel of the temple had begun in 20 BC, brought about by that guy you know, Herod. Herod was not a good man, but he believed that if he did big building projects, people would always remember his name. All right, he didn't put his name on the temple. He didn't brand it like a sports stadium and make them say, the game's coming from the Herod temple. He didn't say that, but he figured everybody would know it's Herod's temple. And so he taxed the people heavily and began a decades-long process. They basically totally remodeled the entire temple court, redid the whole thing. And that work is actually still ongoing in Jesus' lifetime. It will actually continue on the outer buildings until the Romans are approaching to destroy the temple in 70 AD. So it is a magnificent building, no doubt about it. But Jesus has something else on his mind. Do you see all these great buildings, replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Rather than discussing architecture, and Jesus could have discussed architecture if he had wanted to, because God appreciates beautiful artistic expressions, does he not? He appreciates when we, as the men and women created in his image, imitate our Father and be creative. Instead, Jesus tosses out a shocking prediction to his disciples. Now, this temple is the beating heart of ancient Judaism. It's where the priestly class administers the entire law of Moses, where the sacrifices occur, where the festivals take place. Its importance to them exceeds the importance of any building to any American or any Christian. We have no place as truly sacred as the temple was to them. You remember when the Trade Center was knocked down on 9/11? Those of you who were alive then anyway. That was a massive blow to our psyche as Americans. But it was nothing compared to seeing the temple destroyed to a first century Jew. For the temple to be completely demolished, right? Jesus says not that it's going to be damaged. This entire thing is going to be wrecked. Implies that Jerusalem is going to fall and be destroyed too. This is a tragedy that has already occurred to this nation. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, destroyed the walls, looted the city, and burned the temple. Jesus has just told them, get ready, it's going to happen again. Even more thoroughly than the last time. And we know that about what the Romans did when they captured the Jerusalem. They knocked all the stones off the Temple Mount and left it a blank space just to say, don't mess with us. You're not rebuilding this thing. That's quite an unnerving thing for Jesus to drop on his disciples. The guy just wanted to talk about architecture. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to be fulfilled? Now, we get after the disciples often for being a little bit scattered, right? For being a little hasty, for being doubtful, for some of the foolishness. I am shocked that they walked out of Jerusalem, across the valley, and up to the Mount of Olives without asking him about that. They walked 30, 40 minutes without asking the important follow-up question, when is this going to happen? But notice that nobody said to Jesus, Jesus, are you sure? you didn't, misread the signs, right? Are you really sure? And nobody asked him, how would it be destroyed or why? Because when is a much more important question. The focus on the timing from the disciples will dovetail well with the theme that Jesus is going to develop in this chapter. We're going to look at this week and then finish up next week. The theme is going to be preparedness. And so timing is a big question, right? If you know that you have something coming up, knowing when it will happen helps with preparedness. I know this. I've got a 50K next Saturday, which means that right now I'm not running. I'm resting my legs. The older you get, the more rest you need before the race kind of thing. But I'm resting because I want them fresh. If I didn't know when the race was going to be, I might have done a long run the day before, and then I would be in trouble. You need to know. But as you already know, Jesus isn't going to give them a date. He's not going to tell them, circle this date on the calendar. And the signs that he's about to discuss are not going to reveal a date either. Such knowledge was never necessary to take proper precautions. And in fact, would have been counterproductive for every generation except for the one that will live through these prophecies. Imagine if Jesus had said, it's going to be 2,113 years from now. Every generation up until then would have been like, hey, nothing's going to happen, right? We don't have to be worried about it. We don't have to be prepared. The year before that's supposed to happen, people would be scrambling, but nobody would be prepared. So Jesus isn't going to give us dates to put on a chart in order to know that kind of thing. We still are going to be talking about being prepared. Verse 5. Jesus said to them, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming, I am he, and will deceive many. Paul told us that in 1 Thessalonians this morning. In 2 Thessalonians. I thought I had the wrong one. Precaution number 1. We need to be prepared. We need to take precautions. The first precaution is to accept no imitations. A number of ad campaigns have used that as their slogan, accept no imitations. Because knockoff merchandise is a huge problem in the world today. Fake products are everywhere, and they cost the real brands hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The easiest way to avoid not purchasing fakes, never buy popular brands of anything. That way, because the people don't fake the cheap stuff. Well, not as much. There's no market in it. But a fake Messiah? I mean, that's a big deal. It's one thing to fake a Gucci bag or a Rolex watch, but a fake Messiah? Well, there were fake Messiahs before Jesus. We know that from historians. People that claimed to be the Messiah, and people rallied to them, and they led a revolt, and the Romans crushed them. And they said, oops, not that guy. And after Jesus, there are going to be more of them, especially leading up to 70 AD. Jesus is saying that at the end times, people will say, I am Jesus. Not I'm the Messiah, but I am Jesus. We don't have a picture of him, so it's going to be an interesting question. But when the end comes, let me assure you that those who are looking for the real Jesus will not be fooled. That will not be something that you can mistake. Unfortunately, plenty of people will be deceived by false Jesuses. History has shown the power of false prophets to gather followers. We know they can, and they will then too. So in order to be prepared for the end, the people of God need to be on their guard against counterfeits. There's a first step, a good place to start. Verse 7, Jesus says, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen. But the end is still to come. So will there be wars and disasters at the end? Yeah, a lot, right? Read John's Apocalypse. Read the book of Revelation. There's a whole lot of bad stuff happening in there. But Sadly, human history has not made them rare. Wars, right? We may have lived through some wars already. Rumors of wars. I was just reading today about rumors of wars, about China rattling the saber about invading Taiwan. Rumors of wars are always around too. Jesus says, do not be alarmed, because a new round of war, a new outbreak of disease, a new natural disaster is not a sign, despite what over the centuries people have tried to claim. The Black Death was not a sign of the end times. If a third of the population of Europe dying is not a sign, then whatever we're going through is not going to be either. That reminded me, I was in high school in 1990 when the Gulf War happened. Do you remember that people were going around saying prior to that war that it was a sign of the end times? Because armies were gathering in the Middle East, and so therefore this could be the end. And Saddam Hussein could be the Antichrist. That really turned out to be anticlimactic, didn't it? It didn't happen. Why? Because such things are not what you think they are. That actually feels naively quaint, doesn't it, at this distance after 9/11, to think that the Gulf War could have been the beginning of the end times? Precaution number 2, do not be alarmed by the latest news. It's actually good news, good advice on a lot of fronts. But don't, when you see whatever happens wherever, jump up and say the end. Because Jesus said the end is still to come. That's not the sign. Now, I find it fascinating. Every generation tends to think that the trials and tribulations that they're living through are unique. Nobody's had an economic crisis like this. We've never had a public health crisis like this. The government has never been as dysfunctional as this. That just means you are egocentric, because your hurts and your pains seem to be bigger than they really are. But it also means you haven't read any history, right? Because there have been plenty of times, and believe me, my grandmother's generation lived through a lot worse than I've ever seen. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Rest my case, right? Nothing that has happened in my lifetime even compares. But this is something that believers, Christians in particular, and evangelicals even more particularly, are prone to as they tend to get older. And you see this often amongst famous preachers. When they get to the end of their career, 70, 80 years old, they write that book about the end times and how real close it is. Because they can't help but think that God's working on my time frame, that the end of my life is a significant date in God's plans, and so therefore something's got to happen soon. But they've been saying that. The first real hysteria about the coming return of Jesus Christ was in the year 1000. Millennial kingdom, right? They did some math and said, in the year 1000, Jesus will come back. And then when it didn't happen, they said, you guys are dense. It's not 1,000 years from the birth of Christ, it's 1,000 years from the resurrection. They didn't know, by the way, that the birth was in 6 BC. They hadn't figured that part out yet. They said it would be 1,030 something, and so they waited for that, and then that didn't happen. And then there was another round in the year 1500, because, there was some bad stuff going on then in Europe. However, they were wrong. God is not constrained by our point of view. What we think of as good, what we think of as bad, what we think of as a sign, that's not the way God operates. Continue listening to Jesus. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of the birth pains. All those things were already happened when Jesus said those words, were they not? Nations were fighting nations. There were already earthquakes and famines during Jesus' lifetime. And they have continued to happen ever since. Sadly, they are common to the human experience. So using the metaphor of Jesus, this woman who is giving birth to the end times has been in labor for a long time. That seems to be a common sitcom trope, right? I was in labor with you for 20 whatever hours. Good way of guilting your child into listening. Well, this woman metaphorically is got you all beat. Jesus spoke these words about 2,000 years ago. These are the beginnings of the birth pains. As frightening and horrific as these things are, they're only the beginning. And unfortunately, they will pale in comparison to the trouble that is to come, to what actually will happen in the end times. Jesus says you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. Being prepared for the day when it comes is important. The study of the end times is called Eschatology. We have a whole branch of theology based in it. But it's not of interest to only that generation that will live to see these mysteries fulfilled. Before those days arrive, the Church of Jesus will face both challenges and opportunities. Challenges of persecution, opportunities of evangelism. To the disciples hearing Jesus speak these words, especially in that very first generation of the church, there was great animosity between Jews who accepted Jesus as Messiah and those who did not. Paul himself was on the receiving end of much of it. He was beaten and left for dead. His experience was typical. He had some converts amongst his own people, but faced much persecution. And Paul himself will stand before the Roman emperor because of his devotion to Jesus. Several generations after Paul, Christians in the empire, still a minority at that time, will face increasing persecution. And I mentioned that, being asked, will you worship the emperor or do you want to die? It was an either or put to them. The greatest number of martyrs in the church history happened in a few short years under one emperor's reign when the persecution was at its worst. So there's plenty of that in Jesus' day, in the early church, and in the end to come. Jesus says, and the gospel must be first preached to all nations. If you want to ask this question, is there anything keeping Jesus from coming back and establishing his kingdom today? The song we sang earlier, right? What if it were today? Well, from a theological standpoint, this may be the answer to that question. As much as we understand about the will of God, and we should not be overconfident or smug into thinking that we know more about the will of God than we do, but this appears to be one self-limitation that God has shared with us, that the day of judgment will not arrive until the gospel has been fully preached all over the world. Now, of course, the question becomes, when is that, right? Have we reached that point yet? Well, it depends on how we define these terms, nation and preached. Because every country in the world has had Christian missionaries in it, but not every ethnic group. Not quite. We're getting much closer. How much missionary activity does it take to consider the gospel to have been preached to a whole nation? I don't know how God defines that. We don't know how God is measuring that. But we are certainly closer to that being fulfilled in this generation than we were 100 years ago or 500 years ago, without a question, because of modern missionary activity. Verse 11, whenever you're arrested and brought to trial, don't worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given to you at the time, for it's not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. This is a promise aimed first at the disciples for their times, because they will be testifying about Jesus in front of, in synagogues. But it's applicable to other generations. Certainly seems to be. The Spirit is capable of helping anyone witness with grace and truth if the will of God is working in them. While only a small percentage of Christians will stand trial of some kind of like an official trial because of their faith, we can all take comfort from Jesus promising that in moments of need like this, and this is the important part for you and I to hear, in moments of need like this, the Spirit will be more present than usual, not less. When they are put to the test, when their faith is on trial, Jesus says the Spirit will be closer to you then than ever before, speaking through you. Because God will not leave his people in the lurch. Brother will betray brother to death, father his child, children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Unfortunately, even our own family may be divided by faith. This happened in that first generation. We know this kind of thing happened in the first generation of the church. And in the later persecutions within the empire, we know that families turned on each other when they were facing death. But it will also happen in the end times. Humanity has always been capable of this level of evil, of betraying your own family to save yourself. Humanity is indeed capable of great evil, for no better reason than our own lust, for no better reason than our own greed. But in this case, the inspiration for these acts will be hatred against God that spills over on to those who follow him. Jesus says, everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. This is a word of warning both and encouragement for Jesus' disciples. One that works in any generation, whether it be a time of persecution or not. When Jesus says everyone will hate you, that's obviously hyperbole, but it seemed that way to David. You read some of David's Psalms, he felt like he was all by himself and nobody liked him. It felt that way to Elijah, who said, Lord, just take me to heaven now because it's just me against the world. And it felt that way to Jeremiah from prison. The scriptures show us their frustrations, their feelings of loneliness as they stood for the right against those who preferred to embrace evil. This morning, we sang, I have decided to follow Jesus. Some of you might have been surprised we stopped at verse 2, but we did that on a reason. I do not like verse 3 of that song. Though none go with me, still I will follow. No. David was not alone, Elijah was not alone, Jeremiah was not alone, and none of us are alone. With the church, I will follow. With the people of God surrounding me, I will stand. That third verse of that hymn is far too individualistic. We are not asked by God to stand alone. We are not asked by God to be the superhero fighting all the hordes of evil. We are asked by God to stand, as the third song we sang, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand with our brothers and sisters in Christ in this congregation and around the world. In that power, we definitely can stand. And here's the part that Paul was talking about and Daniel was talking about in verse 14. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. The abomination that causes desolation. That's a cooler moniker for the villain of a story than any from WWE or comic books. The abomination that causes desolation. That's a serious thing. That comes from the prophecy of Daniel. That prophecy was considered to have been fulfilled by the Jewish people because in 167 BC, the Seleucid king from the north, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and there's a name for you, he set a pagan pig sacrifice on the altar in the temple. He desecrated the temple by offering a sacrifice to Zeus of pork, which was designed, of course, to mess with the Jews particularly, on that altar. But Jesus is reiterating Daniel. That previous profanation of the temple was only a precursor to the one that is to come. In April of 70 AD, the Roman legions will arrive and put rebel-held Jerusalem under siege. The subsequent destruction of the entire Temple Mount also feels like it's connected to this warning of Jesus. But in the end times, if we understand these things correctly, the temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt, and that temple will be desecrated by the Antichrist himself. Paul writes about that in 2 Thessalonians. We read that this morning. So what does Jesus have to say as we reach the conclusion? Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house or take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. In 70, the Christians of Jerusalem mostly fled Judea before the Romans arrived. Perhaps inspired by Jesus' warning here not to wait, but to take it seriously. The church historian Eusebius, he lived from 260 to 340, he credited the willingness of the Christians in Jerusalem to believe that it was time to leave on a prophecy that came to members of the church living there. He said they were warned by visions and they got out of town. They took Jesus' words here seriously. Notice the extreme urgency that he is warning it will be necessary. When the day of judgment is at hand, saving your own life is the only thing you can hope for. Even a needed possession like a coat to keep you warm on the cool evenings in the mountains is not worth the risk. Better to be cold. So what's the applicability to the future abomination, to the end times? It's hard to tell. Because as you read the book of Revelation, it feels like fleeing isn't going to do anybody any good in those passages. The destruction will be so great. Now, this is not something that can be prevented. Jesus is not giving them this prophecy so that they can change and stop this from happening. He's giving it to them so that they can be prepared when the day comes. And then ending with this, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world, until now, and never to be equaled again. I don't know how much the early church in that first generation prayed following Jesus' words, but thankfully the Romans arrived in April. And the people that were fleeing Jerusalem were not also dealing with the cold that happens in the nights in the winter there. But these words speak for themselves. The end times may be longed for by Christians who want Jesus to come back and fix things, right? How many people are like, Jesus, just get back here and fix this. I don't want to deal with this anymore. Come back, please. And that is an understandable longing on the part of the people of God. But those days will be a time of woe unparalleled in human history. And when I say unparalleled in human history to people that lived through the 20th century, that says something, right? Because we've got a new standard of unparalleled after the Holocaust and with nuclear weapons and all of that. But why must it end this way? Let me close with this thought. Why must human history end in God's wrath? Before God can make a new heaven and a new earth, before God can establish a life that is very different than this, why does it have to end this way? If you're familiar with history or you pay attention to current events, you don't need to ask me that question. A holy and righteous judge, which is what God is, must settle accounts. Those who do not repent and receive God's forgiveness will answer to God for their actions. Moreover, humanity cannot continue indefinitely as we are now. When the Father decides that the time has come to bring an end to the ups and downs, to the victories and defeats of good versus evil in our world. When the Father decides that now is the time to banish evil forever. Evil will not go quietly. Evil will not go without a fight. We know that it will be no challenge to Jesus to smite the enemies of God and bring an end to the revolt of evil against God. But they will not go without a fight. And so that day will come. Five. There's quite a few in this passage. Thoughts of application. Number one, the end times are certainly coming. We already knew that. That's not a doubt. Secondly, false Christs will fool many, but the people of God know better. Thirdly, the latest catastrophe is no more a sign than the last one was. Don't get caught up in the hysteria. Fourth, when God accomplishes his will, like preaching the gospel to all nations, the end will come then, when the will of the Father has been accomplished and not a moment before. And then lastly, our challenge, our call, no matter how close or far we are from that day, keep the faith, stand firm. Stand with me as you